All right, YouTube, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about neutral spine. Should you brace your core? We're going to get into the biomechanics and the function of the core and what it means for your training. So stick around. All right, so today we're going to talk about neutral spine and core bracing. And the first thing that we should get into is what do we mean by neutral spine? So as a position, neutral spine means that I'm neither in extension nor I'm in flexion. And the way that I've traditionally defined that is when the diaphragm, the dome at the bottom of the rib cage, when the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, which is the dome at the bottom of the pelvis, when they're facing each other, I would call that a neutral spine. And the reason that that's significant positionally is because mechanically speaking, that is the position in which the core is going to be able to make the most intra abdominal pressure. Okay. So intra-abdominal pressure is the pressure of the abdominal cavity, and that reduces motion. So a common kind of neutral spine analogy you'll hear is like a 12-ounce can of Coca-Cola, and when that can's closed and when it's pressurized, you can't bend it at all. It's very stiff. And so that's kind of what neutral spine is as a position. And now we're starting to get into the function of it. That function being stiffness. And so neutral spine advocates Stuart McGill, Pavel, a lot of powerlifting, Chris Duffin. They advocate a lot of core bracing. And so let's talk about that. Let's kind of just take a step back for a second. What is the core? Well, I would say that the core is the set of musculature or maybe even anatomical structures more generally that transfer motion or transfer force from the lower body to the upper body. So, you know, the abdominal muscles, the obliques, the lower back, those are what we traditionally think of as the core. And then we can start even expanding that into, things like the serratus that affects the position of the rib cage. You have deeper core musculature, but I don't think we really need to get into that. I think we can just think of the core as the anatomical structures that transfer force from the lower body to the upper body. And so kind of implicit in that or built within that is that there are a lot of different strategies for different movements based on kind of how heavy and what those movements are. So, what do I mean by this? If I'm picking up a tissue off the ground, I think it's perfectly reasonable for me to twist and flex my spine and come out of neutral and just grab something off the floor. That's the weight of a tissue. Okay. If I'm going to pick up a 650-pound deadlift, well, now twisting and flexing at the spine, they become a lot less effective as strategies. Okay. So we kind of have that. We can almost look at it as a spectrum of what the threshold for movement is. Very light, quick movements, I think, in general, are going to lend themselves to more bending, more twisting, more motion of the spine. And, as we talk about neutral spine, a lot of times, the focus is on the lumbar spine of the lower back. Um, as we get to higher threshold tasks like heavy deadlifts, Olympic lifts, and whatnot, we start to get into situations where bracing the core becomes a lot more effective and a lot more useful. So when we talk about neutral spine as a philosophy, I think what we're looking at is we're looking at a set of fitness prescriptions and a set of fitness advice that encourages a lot of bracing. And what I'm going to say to you today is that it encourages too much bracing. Is that a lot of the neutral spine people, Stu McGill and whatnot, they view motion of the spine as bad, that your spine's not supposed to move. Most of the injuries you're going to run into come from spinal motion, and you know they have a set of exercise strategies that are generally going to discourage motion of the spine. Okay. So what's the alternative to this? The alternative to this is exercise strategies or exercise methodologies that are going to encourage and work within the parameters of spinal motion. So there's kind of two that I'll talk about, that I like and that I think have a lot to offer. The first one being WEC method. We've talked a lot about WEC method and the idea of the coiling core. If you haven't seen the video on this channel already about rotational movement, I think it's a great video to watch. Go back and check that out. But the idea of the Weck method in a nutshell, and David Weck's coiling core, is that we have a short side and a long side, and in gait that we're going to have a short side as our stance side. There's going to be contraction of the oblique, rotation towards that side, a little bit of side bend there, and then we have a long side. And the reciprocation of these long side, short sides is where we find a lot of power, and that's a David Weck coiling core. Uh, that's gonna play really heavily into the Landmine University, where the coiling and uncoiling of the core become a dominant focus of what we're trying to accomplish with the movement. The other kind of anti-neutral spine or alternative to neutral spine is the concept of I'll call it movement optimism. And kind of what the movement optimists say is that your body can move in any position, provided that you have adapted to it. So, for example, a Jefferson curl is basically a deadlift, or like a Romanian deadlift in a lot of cases, where you're just going to round your spine maximally and then straighten up. So the spine motion is driving the movement. And the idea with that is, as you get stronger with that motion, the tissue, including muscles as well as connective tissue, fascia, ligaments, etc., as well as probably neurologically too, that those elements of your biology are going to adapt to the motion, and that by getting stronger through these kind of high movement, high flexion movements, that you're going to bulletproof yourself against injury to those structures. So we're going to get into kind of where all three of these things fit into your training towards the end of the video. I'll talk about when you should be using neutral spine and bracing, when you should be using Weck method, coiling core, and when you might want to add movement optimism, things that are high flexion or high rotation flexion, where that has a place in your training. But first, let's talk about why we don't just always want to brace our core. And this is a big change for me personally in my fitness philosophy. Some of you viewers probably remember me from a long time ago teaching kettlebells. I taught the RKC workshop for many years. I ran a gym out of New York City called Catalyst Sport. We had clinical attached to it. We worked with a lot of people that were getting done with injuries and getting back into fitness, or working with injuries alongside their fitness. And in those roles, I think I was, a proponent in general of a lot of neutral spine mechanics. I was a big fan of Stuart McGill. The functional movement screen is, I would say, another kind of, you know, neutral spine kind of, methodology. The functional movement screen involves 7 tests of basic human movement, and it's a way to quantify somebody's movement, and the idea would be to identify injury risk or movement deficiency. I look back on it now here in 2025. I think it's wild to me that you have 7 tests and not one of them involves any rotation. And the FMS guys would say, well, it's kind of built in by way of anti-rotation. You're never rotating in that test, so it's kind of crazy to me. As we get into kind of like, well, why don't I fully believe in these methodologies anymore? Um, what are the shortcomings of a neutral spine? Well, the biggest one that I see is just a tendency towards robotic movement. That rotation is fluid. Rotation has a looseness and an easiness to it, and a storage a conservation, maybe is a better way, a conservation of energy, just by being more biomechanically efficient. When it comes to martial arts and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, a lot of us have been told, certainly myself, coming up through the ranks, that we're too stiff on the mats, that we're using too much tension in our grappling. And I think being tense for every time you need to lift a weight, encourages that. And that's the point of the methodology. But what I'm going to criticize is, I'm going to say that that leads to inefficient movement that takes up too much energy. The tension of muscles, the creation of tension involves energy, That's why you get tired when you're really tense, right? It takes energy to tense your muscles. And so there's inefficiency there. I think there's, compromises to flexibility that because we're not actually training rotation, we're losing our capacity to rotate. And, from an injury risk perspective, we're going to talk about this kind of on my next bullet point here, but you know, from an injury risk perspective, what I see from neutral spine guys is that they're just chasing more and more stiffness. They're chasing a dragon that they're never going to catch. So, as an example, one of the things I've heard many, many people say over the years is, oh, it's not lifting weights that you're going to get hurt. It's when you go to do, when you're lifting weights, you're tense and you brace and you're ready for it. But then after you lift weights, you're going to go pick something up off the floor and you're going to lose your neutral spine. And that's when you're going to hurt your back. And I think that's actually like one of the dumbest fucking things I've ever heard. This idea that you need to be walking around in full stiffness at all times and that any momentary loss of your stiffness is a potential injury risk to you. It doesn't even pass the smell test. It doesn't make any sense at all if you think about it. What a human does, what humans do, in less developed countries where they don't have access to this, kind of information, and they don't have, this culture of weightlifting. Uh, Human spines were meant to rotate and meant to move. So this idea that the best way to become injury free is just by never moving your spine, it doesn't make any sense. And what happens with these guys is that because they lack the capacity for rotation, because they've intentionally undertrained the capacity for rotation, you're fighting nature. So when you're actually having to rotate, now you have no capacity for rotation and you get hurt. And instead of drawing the conclusion that I think is the more logical conclusion and the more intelligent conclusion of like, well, hey, I actually have to learn how to develop the capacity to rotate. People say, well, I just didn't do it well enough. I just didn't get stiff enough, and they're just chasing more and more stiffness, becoming more and more robotic, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. You're losing athleticism, you're losing movement quality, you're losing fluidity in your motion, and you're chasing something that you're never going to catch. So, as we talk about injury risk, a lot of us got taught that neutral spine is a way to reduce injury risk, and again, at high threshold tasks, I do think it is. I think that, if you're going to lift a really heavy box off the floor, if you're going to lift a deadlift, bracing your core is probably the most effective way to do that. And it's the most effective way to do that, not because it's injurious necessarily to flex your spine, but because the more we can involve big muscles, the more we can be biomechanically efficient, the more stress we can take off, the more we can kind of, spread that stress appropriately to where the body can handle it. So, like the glutes, for example, and the quads, the legs, they're able to bear tremendous amounts of force. They're very well oriented, as far as fiber direction, as far as the structure of those bones and muscles. So, when we can put stress into our glutes, keep our core tight, keep our back straight, and transmit power through a stiff spine, that works really well for a high threshold task like a deadlift or picking up a heavy box. And to the extent that you're a UPS driver, for example, and you're picking up boxes all day, and you're bending and rounding at the spine, yeah, like there's only so much capacity for strength that the lower back has. And so when we talk about it, in the context of movement optimism, that you're going to be able to develop the capacity to get through motion by progressive resistance, whatever that motion might be, in this case, spinal flexion, that's true. But your spine, your spinal erectors, and just the concept of spinal flexion more generally, that only has so much ability for adaptation compared to your ability to, build massive power through your hips. So at a high threshold, and we'll talk about this when we get into training methods. At a high threshold, yes, neutral spine does reduce injury risk, but we can't just walk around like a robot for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the rest of our lives. It's just not realistic. So we also need to develop the strategies to effectively and safely rotate. Okay, so you're hearing me talk about what I think a lot of the shortcomings of neutral spine are, and why I don't really subscribe to that as a dominant training philosophy anymore. And what I think is a really good question to explore is, why did it work so well? When I was at Catalyst, we had hundreds of five-star reviews across different, Google reviews and whatnot, Yelp reviews. Got tremendous results with our clients. People that had been in back pain for years were able to get out of back pain. So why did it work? Why is it so effective? Why do people continue to gravitate towards these methodologies? And I think it's a couple things. I think one is that most people just have no ability to even regulate the pressure of their core to begin with. So even something like WEC method, coiling core, that requires a minimum requisite amount of abdominal pressure. If I go to make a short side here on my left, and I just like collapse because I have no abdominal pressure whatsoever, or if you go to you go to the park and you see people jogging and they're just all over the place, their core is a noodle. Uh, that is very inefficient. And because they can't even build the core pressure, they don't have any effective strategy to move their core. So by developing strength, or developing the ability to pressurize their core, they're developing more effective movement strategies than what they were doing. So just that's one thing. The other part of it is getting strong just reduces your pain and injuries. And, you know, neutral spine probably has a bigger place in the weight room than it does in real life. And the reason for that is because in the weight room, we're building attributes like strength and hypertrophy, building muscle, power. And there's a lot of great exercises that can induce, biochemical and hormonal reactions. Like, for example, I do a heavy back squat. I'm going to keep a neutral spine so that I can lift as much weight as possible. And that's going to create, biochemical reactions and hormonal reactions in my body that will let me put on more muscle tissue and build strength. And something that I've talked about, I can't remember which video it was on, it's probably rotational movement, is that Zercher squats and deadlifts and these kind of big barbell lifts, they serve a really important place in our training, because we have to learn how to develop force irrespective of what plane that's in. Can you just take something that's really heavy and just really fucking move it? That's a skill, and that's an important athletic skill before we even get into planes of motion. Can you just move a heavy weight quickly? And so that's a big part of why neutral spine was effective. I think exercise in and of itself, just to get people sweating and moving, is something that's going to help them, get stronger, get more confident, and reduce their pain. So those are the reasons that I think that neutral spine was so effective. So as we kind of get to the end of the video here, let me talk about how I think you should train, and where these kind of three methodologies that I've put out there, where do they fit in? Well, neutral spine bracing, like I said, fits in for very high threshold movements, your squats, your deadlifts, your Olympic lifts, your overhead press, things where the transmission of power from the lower to upper body will be best achieved by having a super stiff, like the transmission in a car, the axle. It drives that force from the engine to the wheels. It has to be very stiff. If it's moving around, that's a loss of motion. Okay, so I still think we need to do squats and deadlifts, Olympic lift, overhead press, things like this. They're still important for the reasons that I've talked about. The next one is WEC method and the idea of the coiling core. I think as we move into more speed and power, I think that's something that we certainly need to address. We've talked about the landmine university, the set of exercises, the landmine snatch, the landmine clean and jerk, split screwdrivers, things like that, where I'm alternating and reciprocating between that short side, long side. That's going to develop a lot of really usable power that you can use in the real world. That most of, like we said, these athletic, dynamic, three-dimensional tasks are going to involve some degree of coiling and uncoiling, whether that's throwing a punch, whether that's going for a big judo throw, swinging a baseball bat, whatnot. These are going to involve varying degrees of coiling and uncoiling your core. And developing that ability directly, I think, is a great use of your time in the gym. We'll also see a lot of coiling and uncoiling. I recommend in the rope flow. So I've talked a lot about rope flow. I love rope flow. I think the rope is a great teacher that as the rope kind of hits the ground and comes back up, the way the rope swings and returns force, it really teaches you how to be fluid. That when you're stiff, you feel it in the rope. The rope clonks against the ground. It doesn't return force. And when you're in the groove and you're moving fluidly, transferring weight effectively from foot to foot, that rope just feels like it's almost moving itself. So rope flow is a great one that encourages proper, rotation of the core in accordance with the WAC method, coiling core. We'll also kind of modify certain exercises and make them less linear. I had an Instagram post about this a while back, and the example I used in that post was Bulgarian split squat. So Bulgarian split squat typically takes place very linear, very straight lines up and down. It's a very sagittal plane exercise. Well, to the extent that our body, doesn't move that way, for a relatively lower threshold task like a Bulgarian split squat, I might be using like a pair of 75-pound dumbbells maybe. So it's 150 pounds compared to, I'm going to search or squat 300-400 pounds. So this Bulgarian split squat falls a little bit lower on that kind of threshold continuum. And so in that case, we can put the muscles in a place where they're more authentic to the coiling core. So we're going to, shift our weight to the side of the working leg. We're going to, have our head in the position where we're head over foot. We're going to have a little bit of that side bend. So through that motion, we're supporting our ability to form a base on that leg, to form a base that supports rotational movement, that instead of just being head in the middle, very linear, I'm putting myself in getting strong in a position where I'm coiled and loaded, and have the ability to uncoil and reciprocate and create that power to the other side. Yeah. So I think those are kind of like the three big applications in my training for WEC method are the Landmine University, the rope, and then the application of coiling core principles to kind of medium threshold exercises like Bulgarian split squat. Another one might be the bird dog row. On a bird dog row, again, I'm going to have a short side, long side. It's an exercise where I'm in a bird dog position and I'm rowing a dumbbell. And again, I just want to build strength from positions where I'm coiled to one side or the other, so I have the ability to explode off that coil. The final methodology I mentioned is kind of movement optimism. I would say that I'm using this term very generally just for the idea that, there's some people that are just like, movement doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is, your ability to adapt the tissue to whatever the demand it is. I think strictly speaking, without context, that's probably a true statement that if your task is to, round your spine and do a Jefferson deadlift, that's not inherently dangerous. If you've never done that exercise before, you load up, 5 plates on the bar, like, yeah, you're probably going to get hurt with that. But, you know, I think that the movement optimism of the three kind of methodologies I've mentioned is one that I probably use the least. I think it is valid. I think the danger of that is encouraging motions that are less efficient. So, for example, if I had to pick up a really heavy barbell, for example, the ability to drive that power or create that power from my glutes and my quads and to transfer that through a stiff spine and let the lats keep the shoulders and spine in position and be able to drive that weight through the floor. That is the mechanically most effective way or most efficient, strongest way to do that. You're letting the biggest muscles of your body take over that. So the danger in going too far down the road of kind of like movement optimism is like, yes, you can adapt your body to a Jefferson, deadlift. But when it comes time to stand up in somebody's closed guard and they're pulling you down, Well, having a little bit more of a braced spine for that really high threshold task of standing up and lifting a heavy person, that's going to be better accomplished and you're going to have more success. Excuse me, you're going to have more success over the long term by learning to develop stiffness. So, kind of in conclusion, neutral spine is one strategy among several for which the core accomplishes its function of transferring power from the lower body to the upper body or vice versa. Neutral spine works really well for high threshold tasks where the weight is very heavy and there's a lot of power demand and the motion is very linear. It falls short because motion is the natural state of human movement. Rotational motion is the natural state of human movement. And that if we completely neglect rotational movement and if we are in a mindset and a methodology of discouraging our body from rotation, we are fighting nature in a battle that we are never going to win. And we're giving up a lot of performance and a lot of movement quality along the way. So yeah, those are some thoughts about neutral spine, how you can apply it to your training. This is obviously a big topic. Fitness nerds love to debate it, so I'd love to hear what you think. Leave your comments down below. As always, if you're interested in working with me directly, either for in-person training here in West Boca Raton, Deerfield Beach, or if you're interested in remote coaching or program, drop me an email, jason.kapnick@gmail.com. You know, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.